Welcome to the second Wisdom Wednesday. Have you ever had a relationship with a friend ruined because someone told them a lie about you? If that's you, then you know exactly what happens in this story. Remember last week we talked about there were three big parts of this book, and they were creation, which we saw last week, and the fall, which we're going to see this week, and then restoration and perfection. Our scripture this week is Genesis 3, 1 through 15. And in this story, Adam and Eve believe a lie that wrecks everything good that God had created in the world. This time, instead of starting with our first question of who God is, I want to start with because the scripture does this, I want to start with our question of what does this teach us about who we are? And so I think this is a story where we can learn a lot about ourselves and how the enemy works to derail us and to derail our relationships. Look at verse 1 in chapter 3 of Genesis. It starts out with the serpent, who is what we know to be Satan now. And he was very crafty, and it says that he came up to Eve, the woman, and he starts out by saying to her, "Did God really say you couldn't eat from this tree?" What he's doing there is he is starting to plow the ground of her heart with doubt. And he wants her to have doubt about who God is. What are his motives really? Did he really say that? What is his heart towards you really? Is he really all good, and does he really have all good for you, and is he really going to be enough, or is he holding out on you? And he did that because he knew that that doubt would quickly lead to distrust. The groundwork had been laid. So look at verse 4 and 5. And in verse 4 and 5, Satan says, "You will surely not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." He plants the lie in the ground that was plowed by doubt and distrust. And in that, he helps her to believe the lie about who God is, that he's not going to be enough, that he is holding out, and that she can find her own satisfaction and her own pleasure by trusting in herself. The critical mistake comes for all of us and for Eve when we turn away from God in disbelief and we put our trust and our faith in something else. But why would Satan want to do this? He knew that doubt leads to distrust, and distrust destroys relationships. You have to know that Satan's main goal is always toward all of us to destroy our relationship with God. And so Eve broke that trust by choosing to trust in herself and her own pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction outside of that love relationship that she had with God. And we do the same thing. It might not be from an apple, like Eve found her satisfaction in that apple that she thought would bring pleasure and bring her satisfaction. But we look for our satisfaction and our own pleasure in popularity, in possessions, in boys, in wild living, or even sometimes in our own perfection. And so we have to think about that tells us something about ourselves. And so that's something that we need to think about as we look at this story. How are we like Eve in the ways that we look to satisfy ourselves? The second thing is that Adam and Eve's response is a lot like ours. If you noticed when you were reading this, what did they do immediately as soon as they messed up? God comes and he looks for them and he calls for them and he asks, "Where are you?" He's not asking for their location. He's asking where their heart is. And he wants to know in our sin, where is your heart? Where have you turned? And what do they do instead? And the same thing, we do the same thing. They hide and they blame. They try to hide from God, and then they try to blame each other and even God. If you hear Adam say, "And it was the woman who gave it to me, and you were the one who gave me the woman." So in a way, it must be partly your fault, God. And we do the same thing instead of taking responsibility for our own wrong choices. But I want you to look at how God responds to, because this is such a critical understanding for the whole rest of Scripture. look at what happens. He does not immediately destroy them. And he could have, and he would have been perfectly right in doing so. He could have done that. But instead, what he does not destroy them. He finds them, he calls them to him. He does give them consequences. There are consequences for their sin. They have to leave paradise where they have been, where everything was perfect. And our sin has consequences because God is a just God. And because he's holy and he cannot look on sin, their choice had separated them from his holy presence. But I really want you to see something in verse 15 because this is amazing. When you look at verse 15, God is giving them what the consequences are, and he says to the serpent, and so he said to the serpent, because you have done this, you will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and her offspring is Christ. And then it says, he, Christ, will crush your head and you will strike his heel. So God has already put a plan in place that is going to make a way for us to come back to Eden. This is where we see the first promise of Jesus, because from Eve, eventually way down the lineage will be Christ. And Satan may strike his heel, but he will crush the head of the enemy. And the head is where the poison is. He gets the victory. And so I've had a lot of people ask me, why didn't God just make it so that Adam and Eve didn't mess up and there just was never sin? And I want you to think about that from our last lesson. Remember, God made us as the only ones in his image, and that meant that we were made for a relationship with him and that we were made with the freedom to choose. And God made us for that love relationship with him. But remember, love is always a choice if it's real love. And you can't make somebody love you or it's not love. God gave us the choice, you and me. He gave us the choice to know, to trust, and to love him intimately. And that tells us so much about who God is. He is not a God who forces us into a relationship with him, but he is a God who gives us the freedom to choose a love relationship with him. Now, remember though, make no mistake, our choice whether or not we want to know, love, and trust God is going to have very different consequences if we choose to turn away from God or we choose to run toward God. The results will be very different. So how can we apply this to our life and or share it with someone else? Number one, you have to know the truth about who God is and who he tells us he is, so that you can't be led astray by the enemy, and so that you won't have those doubts creep in that can derail you from your relationship with God. And you're doing that by studying this book with us. And so you're on the right track to not being derailed. The second thing is that we can apply to our lives is that God, he knows where our hearts are, and we really can't ever hide from him. And instead of hiding and blaming when we mess up, because of Jesus, you and me can come to him instead of running from him. And our sin and shame is covered with something far better than a fig leaf. It is covered with the blood of Christ, and that he has given us a way back to the Father's heart. So this week, remember whose you are and who you are, and don't doubt the great love that he has for you.